That's it for another week. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I really do appreciate it. If you like this episode, then why not like and subscribe on the very device you're using. You can listen to this on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leaving a review really does help me out, and I really appreciate it. Failing all this, just telling someone to their face using your words and your enthusiasm, and that would really help me out, and I would deeply appreciate it. You can follow this podcast on Facebook and Twitter just by searching for Tales from the Mind Boat, or you can follow me on Twitter at Natchtopia, or follow my Instagram account where I'm trying to draw a new picture every day. The music for this podcast was composed by Tim Witt. You can listen to his music right now on SoundCloud just by searching for Tim Witt Sounds. So that's it for another week. This episode was written, read, and produced by me, Trav Nash. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I knew it was a little bit different, and I hope you understand what I'm trying to do here. Until next week, I want you to stay safe, look after yourself, and as always, peace. Monday morning, as I got off the bus and headed across the grey car park that blended into the darkening storm clouds above me, I realised I was still unsteady, and my head was pounding with an industrial drill through the top of my skull into the back of my spine. My body was telling me that I shouldn't repeat another night like Saturday night, but it would be years later down the line until I would eventually listen. The auto-mechanical students in blue overalls herded into a mob of arty photography students and computer science geeks in their first year, and I walked with all these people, and we parted ways until I returned back into the screen printing room that smelt like paint thinners and old sandwiches preserved in shrink wrap that must have been stashed away somewhere in the classroom. Stefan was already sitting at his desk when I came in, and he hand gestured me to come over towards him. As I got closer, he held out his arm and reached to make a fist, and I bumped his fist with mine without even realizing I had even done this. As our knuckles collided, he made a loud drawn-out explosion sound of his mouth and pulled back his fist as his arm was disintegrating from the impact. "Where did you go Saturday night?" he asked. "I think I lost all you guys when we all began to run. I climbed over a fence or something and ran down some laneway until I reached what I think was a golf course. So I walked around that and realized I had no idea where I was." Stefan nodded his head as I rattled off my explanation, like this is exactly what he assumed I had done. "So, how did you get home?" "Well, I could see the city in the distance and thought it wasn't too far, so I started to walk towards it. By the time I actually got into the CDB, it was about 5 in the morning, and the sun was coming up, and the buses were already back in service, so I took one of those home." Stefan bobbed his head up and down, again like a catchy tune was eternally playing in his head, and I wondered if he just tuned out the whole time, was just politely making conversation with me. Finally he said, "It was a crazy night, man. Did you have fun?" "Yeah, I did, until I realized I had no idea where I was, or where anybody went." Just as I said this, our teacher came in, tucking in his buttoned-up shirt into his slacks, while hiking his suitcase up on the desk. "It's gonna be a busy week, kids, so I hope you're ready to get this week's modules done by the end of the week, otherwise we're going to be very behind," he said as he turned the whiteboard over and began to wipe off last week's lessons. My head still hurt. I still felt lost in this unfamiliar world and wondered how I was going to stay awake for the next 6 hours. I looked around the room and saw everyone seemed just as tired and as drained as I felt, and I wondered if anyone had the kind of weekend I had. More than likely worse than mine, based on the looks of their faces, but probably not by much. 28 hours before, I had lost everyone. I couldn't hear anybody chasing us anymore, or flashlights trying to spot me in the dark. I had stopped running by this point. and started to walk swiftly to get as much distance from the train yard as I could. Who knew where I even was now? Nothing seemed familiar. I was in some ancient part of town where old colonial houses were copied and pasted in vast endless roads, all remaining still and silent in the early hours of the morning. I can hear some kind of main road off in the distance and rattling trucks, lit up like Christmas trees, becoming a streak of yellow and white light, somewhere in between those tiny grey stone boxes people called their homes. My head seemed to be straightening up by this point. The workout I gave my heart was the equivalent of a cold shower to wake you up from your self-inflicted zombie slumber. I wandered down, at a normal walking speed now, towards the passing lights and the glow of a service station's bright neon yellow and green illuminated sign. I thought about lighthouses and sailors on ships who had been out at sea for weeks or possibly months, and what a relief it would have been to see a glimpse of civilization again. I had only been lost for less than half an hour, but in my head it felt like time stretched itself as far as it could without snapping altogether. I wandered up to the service station door, and the guy behind the counter sighed as he buzzed me in, and looked disappointed that he actually had to do his job and not look at his phone anymore, or sitting on the counter playing Snake on his old school Nokia phone. I picked up a cylinder of Pringles and a bottle of Coke from the fridge, and paid the guy in a collection of spare coins that I had accumulated in every one of my pockets of my outfit. It was like some kind of magic trick as I kept digging deep into one pocket and pulling out a handful of coins and pocket lint. The service station clerk wasn't impressed and just wanted me to leave, and I doubt I even paid him what I owed him. When I left, I began to follow that main road back to the city that I could see off in the distance. I tucked the bottle of Coke under my arm and began to crunch down on the Pringles as I made my journey back to somewhere more familiar. A car rolled by with some young drunk kids hanging out the window that yelled out, "Hey, Pringles!" And then whatever they said next was in the same direction and speed they were heading in, and I never heard it. I just kept walking and crunching on those thin salty wafers until I got down to the final few that I pried out with the help of gravity and some mystical ability to multitask even in the hazy state I seemed to be still in. I threw the empty tin into someone's recycling bin and held my bottle of Coke in my hand that seemed to glisten and reflect the city lights ahead and the street light above me. It was becoming all too clear that getting back home was going to take longer than I initially thought, and the more sober I became, more prominent this truth was. As I got closer, the sun began to rise, and the traffic became more dense as I rubbed my blurry red eyes that were beginning to itch and longed to be asleep right now. I just had to keep walking, keep heading forward, until somehow I made it back home again.
Oi, what are you kids doing?
Was shouted out from nowhere. My heart jumped up into my throat and dropped to my feet before being snapped back into position like some sort of organ yo-yo. "What's going on? What do we do?" I whimpered, but everyone had already seemed to have been in this situation many times before and just instinctively ran. The sound of scuffling sneakers and overly baggy pants could be heard fading out into all the dark air all around us, while flashlights were now being pointed at me and the train carriage with the half-completed piece. When the light hit me, I froze like a rabbit in the headlight and then began to cautiously step back and try and slip into the darkness again. I noticed a gap in between the train carriage and jumped over the coupling, but still managed to bang and graze my knee. My head now felt like a shook-up snow globe of panic, glitter and dread. I thought about giving up like they do in police dramas where cops had guns pointing towards their backs and your hands are raised in the air. Then I realized I didn't really do anything, but how many people have used that excuse before, and how did that work out for them? I could already see the disappointed face of my mum and dad when they got the call from the train yard police that I was part of some graffiti gang. My mum signed that infamous sign of disappointment, and my dad heartbroken that I would desecrate a sacred site for him like a train yard. All I could do was keep running into the darkest areas I could find. I couldn't even remember the way we all came in, but knew that that fence along the railway track couldn't extend forever, and if they did, then I would have to put my jungle gym climbing skills into full effect. I found some overgrown area where an old tree and a few bushes had grown over the fence and tackled it to the ground, Perhaps it was due to a storm or just nature fighting back, but it was my lucky escape. I hopped over the bush and the fence and headed off down the street, and kept going down as many streets as I could as I was locked into some kind of Pac-Man type maze. It was only when the sound of footsteps only became my own that I began to slow down a little and reset my breathing once again. My everything hurt. This was the first extraneous workout I've done in years, and this wasn't a night to start thinking about living a healthier lifestyle. Stupid Stefan, I found myself saying out loud to nobody, and surprised myself that I thought this out loud and wondered how loud my voice actually was. And who was I to blame someone else for my stupid choices? What was I even doing here? This isn't me. This was somebody else. What the hell was I doing? I felt like I was trying on a new hat and believed it magically transformed me into a new, cooler person. Hanging out in a train yard, being chased by security guards, wasn't cool. Being alone in the middle of God knows where wasn't cool, and I don't think I would ever be cool. I was now lost and just really wanted to go home again. About 3 hours before, I was asked if I wanted to go bombing and had no idea what this meant, but I immediately said yes. I could see other people around me put long winter coats on, while others put the hoods over their heads, and they carried backpacks that clinked and rattled as they were slung over their shoulders. We headed out into the dark suburbia, where streetlights flickered in a strange, irregular pattern, perhaps in some kind of warning that things are not all well and good and might not go as planned. Regardless, we pressed on down laneways and across main roads until we came to some kind of train yard where dark red and brown freight carriages lay dormant in rows along old neglected stretches of tracks that stretched out further than any of us could see in the darkness. As soon as we got close to the nearest blank slate that had already had a few crudely marked names scrawled in black ink all over the top indents of the carriage, a few of the other guys, now with their faces completely vanished into their oversized hoods, climbed up on top of the carriage and began to paint a huge white cloud bubble. 3 people worked at the same time, while Stefan pulled out a sketch pad and began imagining his Cookie Monster sketch idea being applied over this new blank white canvas. Some kind of unspoken plan had been previously agreed on, as one guy started drawing rough outlines on the still drying white paint of huge entangled letters with sharp jagged edges and sprawling lines that broke off in unconventional directions as if they had a life of their own. Stefan somehow managed to weave in his Cookie Monster character in the middle of the sprawling outline, and before long some kind of layup was put into place, and we all sat down in front of the drying paintwork while sparks of pipes and lighters illuminated in the moonlight. A cold breeze rushed in between the carriages, and I closed in my duffel coat, trying to protect myself from potential frostbite. I started wondering what I was doing out here. There was mixed feelings of adventure and creativity of expression, but also the lingering danger of being caught and at worst yelled at. By this point, I was in some kind of passive soft haze, where everything was veiled in smoke and slowed down to radiate all the finer details I don't think I've ever noticed before. I felt like I was transfixed in some kind of spell, and no longer knew how much time was passing, or if it stopped altogether. At some point everyone had moved away from me, and were now all standing in front of the piece, and had already gone to work with their spray cans. Hissing compressed air splattered blue paint and chrome paint onto the blank white cloud, only stopped when they lowered their cans by their side and shook the can up with a rattling ball bearing could be heard speeding around the can that was somehow feeding the paint to the nozzle. The familiar smell of diesel engine and eucalyptus leaves that hung over our head was now beginning to be overpowered by the chemical smell of paint fumes that blocked the nose up until it was the only thing you could smell. Slowly the image began to take shape, when dark thick lines were applied over abstract shapes that already looked like it could be some expressionist painting that could be hanging in a gallery where pretentious art critics would overthink the piece as they scratched their chin and saw more in this painting than actually was there in those straight lines and white empty spaces. Suddenly out of nowhere, footsteps and flashlights could be seen lighting up fence lines further down the tracks. Immediately the hissing of spray cans came to a halt until there was absolute silence. We all knew what was coming. and the question was, what should we do? And the obvious answer was to run. Earlier that evening, I had arrived at Stefan's share house. It pretty much looked like a standard kind of place most 20-somethings would live. Some old house that looked like it was built in the 70s, where families had grown up and moved out and was now rented out to students and young people who had just left the comfort of their nest to make their own journeys in life. Public Enemy posters were blue tacked onto walls, along with De La Soul and Tribe Called Quest posters that must have been stolen from record stores that were advertising their new albums. Loud muffled beats came out of two giant towers next to an old wood grain TV, and thanks to the mixed tape that Stefan had made me, I could now recognize a lot of the music that was being played. The house soon began to fill up with a clash of different subsections of people, from goths to tracksuit wearing homeboys to metalheads of ripped faded Slayer t-shirts, and hip-hop kids who dressed like they were part of some kind of breakdance group from the early 80s. Something about this party was bringing all of us together. It was the kind of party where all groups of people didn't keep to their familiar groups and were all introduced to one another, bridging the gap between subcultures of people I'd never spoken to before. Outside in the overgrown backyard, that was full of junk and unpacked boxes of books and records and gardening tools, stood some old outdoor table and chairs with a glass platter of different strands of weed. People were helping themselves to it and carefully placing it inside rolly papers with care and precision, like it was going to be handed to the Queen herself. Lighters sparked at the tips of people's joint, and suddenly you couldn't be outside anywhere around that table without being completely submerged in a cloud of sweet-smelling weed and tobacco. Joints were passed around and time overlapped over moments, and frames of life went missing or unaccountable. At some point I was sitting on a couch where a Ren and Stimpy cartoon was playing on a TV on mute, and the funky sounds of George Clinton and his band Parliament made it impossible not to take notice and move your head in time with those funky bass guitars and drums. If I could stay forever in that comfy couch, I would have. I couldn't think of anything else I wanted to do right then. Cartoons, funk, and a hazy head full of dreams and a mind sedated from its constant state of worry and anxiousness was the best state of mind to be in at that point in time. 3 days before, Stefan came into class with eyes already red and glazed over as he opened his backpack that was splashed in paint and badges of various symbols of anarchy and teen angst. Out of his bag he pulled out some kind of coloured transparent cassette tape that had a little sleeve inside that was hand-drawn in pen and texture with track listings and stylized art and lettering that he made himself. I was up all night mixing this for you. This tape is way better than the last one I made you. It's got some choice cuts on it, he said to me as he handed across the table. Thanks, I said. I felt like I was being handed some kind of sacred scripture that will reveal the true secrets of the universe, laid over some dope drum loops. The rest of the day he recommended hip-hop artists and DJs I'd never heard of, and expressed his admiration for these bands of unmatched passion, and ended every sentence with, "You have to check it out." He was the ultimate hype man, and I realized I had a whole subgenre of music I wasn't even aware of. Where was all this music, and how did I miss a whole decade of it that had such a distinct culture and a lifestyle that coexisted together? I wasted the latter part of the 90s listening to teen angst new metal bands that were becoming less and less relevant in my life. When I left school early, I found less reason to rebel or be angry about things. I felt a little more chilled out and didn't want to be angry anymore, and hip-hop had such a positive message and a mission statement that it seemed like more of a positive scene to get behind. I began to like everything about it, the music, the people, and the graffiti art that people were forever evolving and bringing their own style to since its initial conception in the early part of the 80s in New York City. Stefan would sometimes pull out a sketch pad and fill it with those incredible designs of pieces he wants to paint around his area, and sometimes brought photos in of his work and was proud when they got featured in local street graffiti magazines. He told me to come out one night because it was a rush to be out there and going out leaving your mark in the world. I said it sounded cool, but I said this with hesitation because I always seemed to skirt on the right side of the law and feared authority and their rigid rules. It was then that he mentioned that he was actually having a house party on the weekend and wondered if I wanted to come. I agreed, and then he said afterwards we could throw up some pieces, and I threw all my better judgment to the back of my mind and looked forward to going. As the final months of the millennium was coming to a close, I was in a transitional period of moving away from all that was safe and familiar. Ever since I had left school, I didn't complete that final year, and I felt this distinct distance from my friends who I used to spend my free periods with, and began to feel our values and similar interests were changing. They all seemed to be in such a hurry to grow up and be these responsible adults, married, with kids, sipping beers over a barbecue while their kids played in their pool. I couldn't imagine anything worse, and still shudder to think of such a life. It was never for me. I've always sought the alternative and some kind of freedom to just do things myself, in my own time and way, and with a little luck, I will find like-minded people who would support and share the same kind of journey. And I had no idea what these kinds of people were, but I assumed they were out there. It wasn't until I went to trade school and began my first year of learning how to be a screen printer that I discovered that there was extremely different types of people than the straight-edge students that I was accustomed to at that stuffy uniformed years I spent at that Christian private school. My class was made up of people of all ages, and we were all in the same boat, out of work and looking to try something new and somewhat creative. It was here that I met Stefan, a tall weedy guy who always dressed like he fell backwards into an op-shop donation bin, and came out looking like he discovered what people would dress like in the year 3030. He had a confident personality that was unique and full of conviction and excitement with whatever he was talking about, and we both shared this interest in lesser-known genres of music, and this was the seed of our friendship as we began to share mixtapes and throw around names of bands and labels that the both of us should get into. Stefan was ultra cool and laid back. He peppered his conversations of strange made-up slang words that seemed unique to him, and it was contagious enough that I found myself using the same random words, confusing anyone who wasn't aware of the context I was trying to use them in. I lacked that self-assured confidence Stefan clearly had, but he became this instant role model, someone to aspire to. Even though he was a little older than I was, I desperately wanted to be that kind of person who went with the flow of things and had a deep love for music and just wanted to share his passion with as many people who would listen. I don't remember learning anything about screen printing that year, but I clearly was schooled into the subgenres of music I never knew existed. My education was the teachings of Chuck D, the Beastie Boys, Ice Cube, Prince Paul, and James Brown and DJ Shadow, just to name a few. And suddenly I found this new optimism that there was a space somewhere that I could occupy. And suddenly I wasn't the odd one out anymore. I had found that little place in the world with people that had the same interests as mine. And suddenly I felt like, for the first time, I was on the right track and in the right state of mind. Hey, welcome to episode 166 of Tales from the Mind Boat, the slow-moving boat ride into the hazy Sunday morning recesses of my mind. It's Trav Nash speaking. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. It really does mean a lot to me. And today's episode is all about meeting one of my first influences, a super cool dude who had a super cool lifestyle, and how I desperately wanted to fit into his way of life. So it's a good show, and all you need to do is sit back, relax, think about what are you going to do tomorrow as we set sail.
As we set sail.
Hey, this is Trav here, and just a quick reminder that this podcast relies on the kindness of my Patreons, and I would like to thank the following people: Bill, Brendan, Grant, Lisa, Mog, Dan, and Paula. Your constant monthly donation really helps out, and if you can spare $1, the link to my Patreon is in the description. Anyway, thanks for listening. Here's the show.